Hi, welcome to Miss Richardson's U.S. History 5-Minute Lectures. This information will be U.S. Notes 3.4, U.S. Foreign Policy Shifts. It includes information that aligns with the first section on your Unit 3 study guide. Remember, you control this lecture. Pause every time you need to, write down the information you need, make sure you're using your study guide to help you figure that out, and write down any questions you have. And you can also re-watch this as many times as you need. Now let's go ahead and get started. While the war raged in Europe, as we've been talking about, the U.S. attempted to remain neutral. They sold weapons and other military goods to Britain on a cash and carry basis, meaning that Britain had to pay for the goods up front and had to transport them on their own ships. They only sold them to Britain, they did not sell them to Germany. That whole cash and carry idea was part of the Neutrality Act of 1939. Roosevelt also began a deal with Britain that was called the Destroyers for Bases deal. Under this deal, the U.S. traded American destroyers, ships, for land to build military bases on in British-controlled areas of the world. So Britain gave us land, we gave them ships. So while America claimed neutrality, we were really kind of taken aside already in the war. But it wasn't going to be European events that were going to pull the U.S. into World War II. As I mentioned previously, in the 30s, Japan had invaded China. By 1941, they controlled most of the Chinese coast. They were also targeting other areas in the Pacific and Asia, attempting to build a Japanese empire. And so we did some maps and things so you know about this. Roosevelt was trying to stop Japanese aggression by freezing Japanese assets in the U.S. and placing an oil embargo on Japan. But their actions continued. So we knew it was only a matter of time until the U.S. really had to become involved in World War II. So knowing that, in January of 1941, Roosevelt realized American neutrality was limited. He could see the writing on the wall. He knew that soon we would have to take sides. In order to encourage Americans to support involvement in the war, Roosevelt gave his Four Freedoms speech during the State of the Union address. He used this speech to start to prepare Americans for the fact that we would be joining World War II at some point. The freedoms Roosevelt discussed and promoted included freedom of speech, freedom of worship, freedom from want, and freedom from fear. And these are illustrated here by Norman Rockwell in some very famous paintings. So this idea, this whole speech, the four freedoms and why we're going to fight for these and why they're so important for the world, promoted internationalism. Not our current policy of isolationism, but this other policy. So we know that isolationism is the policy of staying out of international affairs. Internationalism is basically the exact opposite of that. It's a policy where a country must become involved in the affairs of other countries. We need them for trade. We need them for our economic growth. So in order to protect ourselves and other countries, we have to be involved. Americans began to look beyond the U.S. and see that there were events happening in the world that could not be ignored. These events would impact us. So while we still weren't quite ready to join World War II, Americans began to see the benefit of internationalism over isolationism. So the American foreign policy attitude was starting to shift. That's the end of Notes 3.4. Hopefully you learned something. If you have any questions, make sure you ask them in class tomorrow.